Hi, welcome or welcome back to Trail and Ultra Running Training. My name is Will France. I'm a running coach and a strength coach, and the whole goal of this podcast is to help you train a little better so that we can have some more fun out on the trails. Today, we're going to talk about the long run. This is the thing I've been thinking about for a while now, probably about a year, if not more. And if you find this helpful, I'd really appreciate if you subscribed or followed or whatever is the thing, whatever button on whatever platform allows you to get notifications or just auto download these things. And if you don't want to do that, then please share it with somebody or leave a rating. So today let's talk about the long run. And I feel like there's a bunch of opinions on this idea that there's a weekly long run, right? And it's been this staple for a very long time where you do some harder training throughout the week or these shorter, more frequent runs. And then on the weekend, we do this big, longer piece. And there's a lot of background that probably maybe you don't care about. But very briefly, it was largely popularized with people like Lydiard, who would do block periodization, where they do these speed pieces. And then they're working so hard throughout the week that maybe they weren't necessarily getting a bunch of the upper or lower end aerobic stuff. So they did most of their aerobic stuff by putting in a big weekly long run. Now, those weren't necessarily easy because these were very good athletes. So they weren't always an easy long run, but they are putting on a bunch of miles. It's still mostly an aerobic space for these people. And it was to some degree a maintenance of aerobic fitness and testing mechanism for some level of fueling while they sharpened up their speed coming into distance races. Now, almost a year ago, I think it was last December, Camille Herron wrote or was interviewed by someone for Trail Runner Mag and talked about skipping the long run. If you haven't read it, I'm not going to completely summarize it here. Just go read it. You can search Camille, skip the long run into your search engine of choice. But very simply, the person who has the most robust distance records on the planet probably never really runs more than 2 hours in training. And it's not just her. I was also listening to Steve Magnus and John Marcus on the On Training podcast, and they were saying that the long run was probably a little bit overplayed for marathoners. It's not that it doesn't have a purpose, it just might not need to be the weekly event. And it doesn't need to be this constant week over week build that we often see. And it got me thinking that I wonder how much this might apply to those who aren't elite athletes and those who just kind of do this recreationally or for fun or who are getting into the sport. And kind of got me testing over the last little bit because you never know. I'm sure these things apply to people like Camille and Steve, but I never really know how much these, what we might call higher level training concepts, apply to someone like me who doesn't run very fast and hasn't been running very long and may not have the long endurance fitness background of someone like Camille. So if you're wondering, if you're training for something like 100 miles, wouldn't it be really valuable to get go these long distances and see? If you are training for an ultra, I feel like we know this concept of specificity, so it might be important to do these really long efforts. So it felt a little dichotomous to be having this separation from elite coaches and elite training protocols that just might not play into some level of common sense. So people immediately started talking against Camille when her article came out, and it's something like it only works because she's so good, and it only works because her volume's really so high, and she does 1-2 hour run per week, or 2 maybe. So at her paces, that's still pretty long, and all of those are valid. I also think that's kind of the point. I think with these objections, we're almost making the point for her. The point is we can still create a very significant training stimulus without spending upwards of like 4, 5, or 6 trail hours on the trails almost every Saturday. And I know that a lot of people would say that's excessive, but when we're talking about certain terrain and we're running mileage-based programs and looking at these things, then that can be a very realistic outcome of some of the planning, where you're unintentionally committing yourself to running like 5 hours 3 Saturdays in a row with a back off week and doing that for a few months on end, right? Camille is a genetically gifted athlete and she has a very long background in endurance. It doesn't mean her training somehow like defies physiology. We're overlooking what she's doing, and I think it might be potentially detrimental, right? I really like being out in the mountains for a long period of time on Saturday. It doesn't mean it's an ideal training stimulus, right? It also doesn't mean that it fits very well into my life at the moment. So these things can further, like these very long runs can be really expensive in a wide variety of ways. So one, the very obvious term of expensive is fueling. Depending on what you use for fuel, you might have to take out a second mortgage just to support your gel habit if you're running for 5 hours every Saturday and then a back-to-back and whatever, right? Like it gets pricey, which is one of the reasons I use a like very cheap just maltodextrin. However, it's not a thing that we necessarily want to do every week. It also gets expensive from a time commitment standpoint. 6 hours in the woods on Saturday requires me to figure out what I need to do with my dog. It either needs to get sitting or whatever, because I live in a small apartment and I just feel bad. I don't want to like leave him here for 7 hours at a time once we talk about travel, etc. And he cannot last that long in the mountains. He's got a couple hours in him and he's pretty awesome for a couple hours and then he gets tired, right? So like he's just not going to be a 20-mile dog, and that's okay. Some people may not be super distancy people. He's not a 20-mile dog. So I need to figure out what to do with him if I'm going to be out in the woods all Saturday. And I'm sure that's doubly true for children, because while I could just leave him in my apartment for a few hours, you probably can't leave your 2-year-old child just in your apartment for a couple hours without violating some sort of law. And then we also have the expense of recovery. Depending on your fitness and how hard you push and how long you've been doing these things, it can take a really long time to recover from a long effort in the mountains, especially if you're kind of newer to the sport. And this is one of the reasons I think we're maybe not doing some things in an ideal way, or maybe if we gave people different options, then we might have some more success, or we might get other people, like new people, into the sport, right? Because if we look at a lot of training plans, including ones I have written as I like rethink these things, we do these very like 3 weeks of progressively building high mileage, and then we take a week of step back, and then we do that again. And the 3-1 ratio is not great for a bunch of reasons, but it's safe. I understand why we use it. That's not the point here. The point is that we probably don't need this consistently increasing long run every week for those 3 weeks, because, hey, you might not be recovered by Thursday, depending on how long you were, right? Like we know that if you go run a marathon very hard, you're probably not technically recovered for 2 to 3 weeks. So even if we pull back on the effort, like a marathon is probably raced in the upper ranges of like lactate production zone, or like lactate threshold things. You're not quite at threshold, but you're just below, and that's what you're going to hold for most of your marathon. And we're not running these long runs quite that quite that hard. We should be in the easy zone, but it's still a lot of time on feet. It's still a lot of impact. So you're not going to be recovered by tomorrow. It's going to take you a few days. Could take you 3, 4, 5 days, depending on you and your background. And as a result, you are going to not miss, but not really get a bunch of training benefits over those days because you're going to be kind of in this recovery hole. Further, it is hard to recover because we're struggling with a food thing. You're not going to eat. Most people are not going to eat meals while they're out running for 5 hours. Hopefully, you're using carbohydrates. That will kickstart your recovery. It will help things go faster, and it will help you fuel and run better. But we're not going to really be getting a bunch of protein. We're not going to be really getting a bunch of fats. We need those things, and we need to stop the damage stimulus so we can do the rebuild stimulus, right? Those things don't really happen very well at the same time. So we need to have this recovery time. And if we're not recovered till Wednesday, let's just say, then maybe we're going to kind of miss a bunch of training stimuli that we could get on Sunday, Monday, Tuesday. And when we look at training as a whole, there are 3 things we're really trying to achieve. One is a constantly increasing stimulus. That is how we make progress. We can increase it in multiple ways. It can be more miles. It can be faster. It can be what Steve Magnus calls stuff, right? Toss strides in or surges or whatever. We can increase the stimulus as more than just mileage, but that's how we create progress with training, is to increase the stimulus. And on some end, we think about doing this maybe in a weekly fashion, and I think we might think about that too much. It's partially just due to short-sightedness and the fact that maybe we signed up for a race and we're trying to get it done in 8 weeks, and that was just a mistake. But if we take a yearly training cycle, then we should probably think about increasing the stimulus by months, right? You'll have a stimulus 1 month, and then your second month should be more. And that should continue really as long as you're trying to or able to improve in this sport. So increasing stimulus. We also need to use a stimulus that's relevant to your goals. I wrote an email about this. It's probably going out right about now. And there I made a comment about bocce ball, which is very true. But if you're really good at bocce ball, it's not going to be relevant to you being good as an ultra runner. But we can get a little more detailed here while I drone on, or at the very least a little less pithy. Probably also don't want to do a ton of swimming, right? So if someone's training for their first 100-miler, we can really find a lot of value from cross-training. But swimming, unless you just really love it, it will have some cardiovascular crossover. But beyond that, you're not using your legs. One of the biggest things we see in new runners is that they have they struggle to take as much impact as they need to take. So while swimming could be beneficial from the fact that it's completely weightless, it also doesn't really give you that mild version of that. So probably don't want to do a ton of swimming. We want it to be relevant, right? So we need to increase the stimulus over time, and we need that stimulus to be relevant to our goals. And then number 3 is probably the most important. We need to recover. We can't just keep throwing stimulus at the problem and hoping to make improvement. We also need to recover and let the body adapt and make the changes that the stimulus was supposed to make, right? And as I mentioned, it's just hard to do that when you're spending half of your day out on a long run. It is hard enough to eat. It is hard to eat enough food. It can affect your sleep. We're getting up early. We have things to do, right? So maybe if we give ourselves a little more recoverability, provide some more time, then we might achieve a similar, if not improved, version of ourselves or of our training with less stress on the body in a single session. Now, I'm not saying the long run is useless. It also gives a very important opportunity to test your fitness and durability and fueling. If we never run long, you may learn that your fueling strategy completely falls apart at the 4-hour mark, right? This is what happens to a lot of marathoners who just get wrecked by the by the wall at like 20 miles, right? Talk about this wall at 20 miles, 22 miles. Part of that is because they never really go over that in their training. And for a lot of marathoners, that's also right about the time that they're going to run out of glycogen, just based on pacing. So they, one, have some anxiety about never going over that mileage before, and two, their fueling strategy is garbage, so they don't have enough left in them, and then they just whack through this wall. This is one of the only ways you're going to figure this out is to do it. So this is why your first marathon probably isn't going to be your best. It's also why you probably shouldn't run a 100-miler as your first ultra. It's just a lot. So we should probably do something in training that allows us to test this along the way and adapt as needed. So the long run does have a lot of value. I'm just not convinced it has a lot of value entirely as a training stimulus. Maybe we do this as like a bi-weekly thing every 2 weeks or 3, or maybe even monthly, where instead of the current protocol that we often see of like 3 weeks of a progressively increasing long run, we keep that more static, increase our speed work a little bit, maybe start to run a little longer throughout the week. So maybe if you can get more shit done on a Saturday, maybe we can commit 90 minutes on a Monday instead of only limiting everything to an hour throughout the week. And then every 3 or 4 weeks, we put in this big effort of like 4, 5, 6 hours, go run a test race if you need to. And this would allow you to push a little harder there, really test the fueling strategy that you're looking for, and then make adjustments that would probably be more relevant to your actual race, right? I don't know. I don't think that there is a single answer here. But if we view the long run for what it probably is, a really fun time in the woods where we test our fitness, then it probably doesn't need to be a weekly affair. And I also think there are multiple ways to train. If you like spending most of your Saturday on the trails, you have the means to do so, and you're able to recover so that you can still train during the week, then I think that really sounds great. But it doesn't fit for a lot of people. They aren't able to recover quickly enough. It's a big burden on the stuff they need to do throughout their week. It removes other stuff that they might enjoy. So I think like our commitment to massive weekends might just be a little counterproductive. For some of us, it's creating this huge recovery debt that impedes our progress, in addition to creating to some level of stress from trying to get all the shit in our life done. Right? As it is, I'm not running very long at the moment. I'm just running frequently, and I still fail to clean my house. So if I had to disappear for most of a Saturday, I can't imagine what this place would look like, right? So it's just one of those. Now, I think another consideration is that it's also probably affecting newer runners more or disproportionately. If we see some reduction in benefits of training around the 2 to 3 hour mark, and there's not perfect studies on this, I want to be clear and open. A lot of them are not really done in humans because it's hard to study these things in humans, but we do seem to see a lack of progress, especially at the like tendon and bone development adaptation level around the maybe 2 hour mark, probably ranging from like 90 minutes to 3, depending on the person. Now, if we see that reduction and we're worried about really trying to harden or toughen or train the like bones and tendons of new people so that they don't get things like stress fractures, then I don't understand why we're hammering them into a recovery deficit on a weekly basis. If we just cap their runs at like the 2 to 3 hour mark and push a little harder, then they'd have more time to recover and eat and provide the recovery stuff. We could also like leverage a little more of a steady pace where they produce some lactate, and maybe even start giving some intro level speed work. And it's just a thought. I've been playing with this, and you're kind of watching me as I go through this process. But I don't know the answer. I don't think there is an answer. I think there are many answers to the training question. I just think the long run can be a big barrier to people, even trying to run long distances, because of the time commitment and because of how shitty it makes them feel for a few days. If we see a training plan and we know that you can only run like 4 to 5 miles per hour, so anything over 12 miles is probably a 3-hour commitment, then it's intimidating. And you just kind of know you're going to be sore and wrecked for half a week. And maybe it's just because I got into this late, so I remember what that feels like. I remember looking at some of these training plans and seeing like 20 to 22 miles and just like my eyes bugging out of my skull. But I think there's more than one way to train for a goal. And I've been following that idea for myself and for those that I coached the past year. And some people have been doing the weekly long runs where they disappear into the mountains, often with their running group, and they have a great weekend. And guess what? They're killing it because we know that works. And it's been really productive, and whereas others have been doing the other method where they do a little higher speed. They do shorter weekly runs. We like leverage frequency. There's even been some 2-a-days here and there. And then monthly, every 3 to 6 weeks is what it's been. We go out and test the system. They're also doing great, setting PRs. In the past year, I've just had people perform really well, all the way up to 200 miles on a wide range of strategies. And the only consistent thing has been running frequently, running a lot, constantly increasing the stimulus, and using a plan that actually fits their life. And just to say that a lot of stuff works. That's it. You can do a lot of stuff doesn't work. Also, before we think that like we're gonna go just do whatever we want in training, like you do actually have to create adaptations that are going to support the goals you want to have. But there are many ways to do this. And if you find a system that allows you to be consistent and still leads to progress, then that is probably where you're going to be. And over the next year, I plan to like do some things that show this, at least for myself. I've been doing this like shorter, harder training, and every like couple weeks I've been going out for a thing, and it's been going incredibly well. And I plan to like every couple months maybe do something longer and more ridiculous. It might be a race, it might be a self-supported thing, probably the latter, because I'm not all that motivated by being in a race. I love the race environment, I love volunteering there, but I don't necessarily need to be in it. But we're going to do some stuff and see how training works. And I try not to announce things publicly, largely because I'm very susceptible to a particular mental phenomenon where when you tell people something, you often get an undue amount of praise for just thinking about doing the thing, not even doing it yet. So you get that dopamine hit, even though you haven't done the thing yet. So I just don't tell people I'm going to do things. Some people benefit from public accountability. And if that's you, then announce across the world. It is not as much of a driver for me as it would be a detriment. So instead, I tend to keep things a little closer to the vest until they happen, and then I will share the results of stuff. So we'll see what happens over the next year. But I can say that I've been seeing weekly improvements in speed and strength at a moderate amount of miles, and only lifting at most 2 hours per week. I've been training very hard, and I test my recovery, and it's been higher than it's probably ever been. So something's working, at least for me. Anyway, you don't have to completely change your training, but also don't feel like you have to train like someone else just because it worked for them. So I don't have perfect answers on this, and very clearly we know a system that works. I do want to say that, doing this weekly long run build is effective. We know that. I just think that there's also other things that could be effective that might work better for certain people. Hope that helps. Hope that you have a great day and go have some fun on the trails. Thank you again for listening to the Trail and Ultra Running Training Podcast. I can't tell you how much I appreciate it. Just a reminder, nothing you hear on this podcast is medical advice, and you should always speak with a medical professional before making changes to your training or your nutrition. If you enjoyed the podcast or found it helpful, please leave a rating or review. It tells the algorithm robots that people like it, and that means more people will hear it. Or even better, just share it with someone who you think would benefit. If you prefer a video version, head to the Trail and Ultra Running Training Group on Facebook, or check out the Mountain Goat Endurance Coaching YouTube channel. Thank you again, and I hope you have a great next run.